Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Bill Cook, the Director of Operations for STAND. Welcome to the December 8, 2015 edition of the National Emergency Coalition conference call, brought to you by STAND, Staying True to America's National Destiny. It's my honor and privilege now to turn the call over to President of STAND, Bishop B.W. Jackson.
Thank you so much, Bill. I'm very excited. I guess I always am, because we have a diversity of guests, and they come from different backgrounds and different kinds of roles of leadership. We have today someone who is a friend of mine, one of my compatriots here in Virginia, fighting the good fight. I'll introduce him in a second. But first, as always, let's open with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, first and foremost, we are just grateful to have you in our lives. We are grateful to know you. We are grateful for what Jesus Christ has done for us in dying on the cross for our sins. We are in the season of celebrating his birth, his being born of a virgin, laid in a manger, wrapped in swaddling clothes. Lord, for some people that is a myth, but for us it is the reality of salvation, and we are grateful. And then, Lord, we're grateful to be Americans, grateful for the freedom, the opportunity, the prosperity to which we have access. And we want desperately for our country to remain prosperous, but we believe that in order for that to happen, it has to remain true to the fundamental principles and values upon which our nation was founded. We are fighting to see that happens. And, Lord, we are beset from within and without, those from within who want to fundamentally transform the country, and those from without who want to destroy the country. Help us to gain victory over both. We thank you for Congressman Rob Wittmann and for what you've done through him and with him, and we pray that you'll continue to give him strength and courage to fight the good fight of faith, because, Lord, indeed, the fight seems to be intensifying. But we believe you for victory, because you said, if God be for us, who can be against us? In Jesus Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, folks, thanks as always for staying in the fight. The fact that you're on this call means that you are engaged. You're in the battle. You want to know what is going on. And we bring people on who can inform you, give you their perspective, to whom you can ask questions and have some discussion, with whom you can have some discussion, so that we can better educate ourselves about what is going on. Of course, I said he's a friend of mine, but he's also obviously Congressman for the 1st District of Virginia. He and I run into each other quite frequently at a variety of events, and you can read his biography, but it's particularly good that he is here right now, because he is on the Armed Services Committee, serves a number of roles on that committee, and of course right now we are facing an existential threat to our country, and this is really all about what we're going to do about that, and he's right there in the midst of those discussions. So couldn't ask for a better guest at this moment. So, Congressman, thanks so much for joining us. Listen, take 10 to 15 minutes if you want that much time. You're welcome to it, to tell us what's going on from your perspective, what Congress is doing right now, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. And if you could stick with us until about 12:30, that would be great.
Yes, indeed. We will do that. Bishop Jackson, thanks so much. Thanks for your leadership, and you have indeed been a fantastic friend, and I treasure your friendship, and I appreciate what you're doing with STAND in making sure that people get this up-to-date information on things going on around our nation in a number of different realms. So thank you so much for your leadership. And as you point out, I am honored to serve on the House Armed Services Committee, and I am the chairman of the Subcommittee on Readiness. Now, readiness is a term of art, but essentially it is this. Are our men and women in uniform properly trained? Are they properly equipped? And are we modernizing our forces to keep up with the threats around the world? And as you know, today, probably more so than at any time in our recent history, the threats are manyfold. They're not just the threats of ISIS or Daesh, however you want to term them, but they are also threats from conventional forces like China, like Russia, like North Korea, like Iran. And I want to put those things in perspective, because today we are charged with making sure that our military is ready for any of these threats. And as we see these threats around the world growing, we see Vladimir Putin being very, very aggressive. We see ISIS continuing to grow. You know, when the when the president says that they are contained, they are anything but contained. We see that their area of influence and the area that they hold continues to increase in Syria and Iraq, so they are not contained. They continue to operate there in the most barbaric and treacherous way imaginable, and we are not doing anything significant to stop the spread of ISIS in that region. In addition to what we see with Putin, we see Xi Jinping being very aggressive in China, reclaiming land in the Spratly Islands, which don't belong to them, specifically for naval operations there in the South China Sea. We see Iran just yesterday test firing a ballistic missile that can deliver a nuclear warhead thousands of miles, in clear contradiction and violation of UN requirements. And of course, and this is aside from this nuclear deal that the president has entered into with Iran, which by any measure is not a good deal. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. But then we have North Korea, too, the same way, testing missiles. All of this aggressiveness going on in a world that is becoming less and less safe. And in the face of that, instead of saying, let's improve and build our military to meet that threat, we see a situation where this administration continues to say, let's draw back our military. We now have an army that's going to go down to a strength of 450,000 soldiers. That'll be a reduction of 40,000 soldiers in the face of these growing threats. We have a Navy that today has only 287 ships. By any measure, it should have well over 300. I think around 330 ships. Our Navy is smaller than the Chinese Navy. While our ships are good ships and they do a lot, at some point quantity has a quality all its own. And to have presence around the world, you need to have ships. And instead of growing a Navy, our Navy is shrinking. And we aren't doing as much as we need to maintain the ships that we have. So we've got that issue. We have an Air Force that is smaller than it's been throughout its entire history when it moved from the Army Air Corps to its own branch of the service in 1947. So we see the threats around the world are increasing, yet our readiness continues to decrease. This is a sobering fact, Bishop Jackson, to restore full spectrum readiness. That's to assure that our airmen, our soldiers, our sailors, and our Marines are fully trained, all properly equipped, and that our forces are modernized. The soonest that we can achieve that for any of our service branches is 2021. That's how far behind we are, and that's what we face. And don't think that our adversaries around the world aren't keenly aware of that and won't try at every turn to try to exploit that. And when we send these messages about, well, we're not going to do this, and when you listen to the president's speech the other night, which essentially said nothing new, didn't outline any comprehensive plan as to how we're going to defeat ISIS, was at best lukewarm, our adversaries, including ISIS, look at that and go, hey, the United States is not going to do anything more than status quo, which really isn't much of anything other than some airstrikes. In fact, our allies are flying more airstrikes into the region than we are. We talk about this coalition, 65 members in this coalition. Bishop Jackson, there are only 9 members that are active in doing anything in the region in Syria and Iraq to defeat ISIS. Our Arab partners that are part of this, Jordan, no longer flying missions into that airspace. Saudi Arabia, no longer flying missions into that airspace. United Arab Emirates, no longer flying missions in that airspace. Bahrain is the only nation there flying a minimum number of sorties into that area attacking ISIS. We only have 9 members of that 65-member coalition, which is essentially non-existent in how it's prosecuting the fight against ISIS. And that, to me, speaks volumes about what's happening with this effort. I believe the president is absent in leadership. I believe in order for things to happen there, for us to defeat ISIS, the U.S. has to lead. That doesn't mean that we need thousands of our men and women on the ground there, but it does mean that we have to lead. We have to bring other nations and partners together and say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, and here's a comprehensive strategy to defeat ISIS. There is no comprehensive strategy to defeat ISIS. If you listen to General Dunford, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs the other day, says, well, we've got a strategy, but it hasn't been properly resourced. You listen to Secretary Carter when he came before us, and talked about us being at war, and then had to walk that back because really we're not at war. There hasn't been a formal declaration on authorization of use of military force by the Congress. So at every turn we see a fragmented effort, the United States part, to prosecute this effort to defeat ISIS. It's piecemeal. It is at best marking time. I think this president is waiting for whoever ends up in the Oval Office next to take this up. I think he has no appetite for this. There's not a comprehensive strategy here. There is not anything with any wherewithal that shows that it can be successful in defeating ISIS or successful in deterring this other aggression around the world. And that's one of the reasons why ISIS formed, is because there was a vacuum there. There was nobody willing to come in and said, listen, we're going to have governance in this region. We're going to make sure that we go after those extremist elements of Islam, and we have to be able to identify the enemy as it is. This is Islamic extremism, Islamic radicals that are perpetrating these acts of horrific violence against individuals in the region. And now we see here in the United States, if we aren't willing to have an aggressive strategy, if we aren't willing to lead, because if we don't, nobody else will, if we aren't willing to bring partners together and say, this is what we're going to do, if we aren't willing to go to those Arab nations and say, you have to go with us. I just visited the Middle East several weeks ago. I met with President al-Sisi, the president of Egypt. He is beside himself. We met, had a conversation with our congressional delegation for 2.5 hours, and he is livid about what the United States is not doing in the region. He has Libya to his west, where ISIS today is training. He has al-Qaeda in the Sinai Peninsula, perpetrating attacks against Egyptians. And he is looking for help from the United States, where we aren't even willing to sell them military hardware to help them defend themselves. So what are they doing? They're buying military hardware from Russia and France. Now, we have been an ally of Egypt up until recently, and after Hosni Mubarak, who did we support? The Muslim Brotherhood. That's the administration supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. And then here we are today, and let me tell you, President al-Sisi is still mad as fire about our tacit support for the Muslim Brotherhood there and not willing to help him as a leader there. I then went to Saudi Arabia with our congressional delegation, visited with the Crown Prince there, with their Minister of Defense, and they are also beside themselves. They're having to fight the Houthi rebels in Yemen because, again, of a vacuum of leadership there. Those Houthi rebels, which, by the way, are being supported by Iran, which has been enabled and empowered by this nuclear agreement the U.S. has put in place that allows them now to have about $150 billion to spend to do things like support the Houthi rebels in Yemen and to do things like supporting Hezbollah, which is fighting in Syria. We see those things destabilizing the world, and the Crown Prince there are also beside themselves. Said, listen, you all have been a great ally, but what you have done is to create further instability in the Middle East. You don't have a comprehensive strategy. This is not helping in the region. You have been our ally. The nuclear deal with Iran destabilizes the region. We asked them specifically, do you believe that you will need to acquire nuclear weapons? And their answer was this: we are going to keep all of our options open, which now means we're going to have, I think in the near future, a nuclearized Middle East on top of what we see there with ISIS today. So we see military readiness degrading in the United States, or even our capability to prosecute those efforts to stamp out aggression and extremism around the world. Our ability to do that is being reduced by an administration that does not want in any way, shape, or form to enable the military with resources or with policy to do the things that it needs to do. And then we see the instability around the world, the dangers around the world increasing. We see world leaders looking towards the United States for us to provide leadership, and that not happening. It is an extraordinarily so Bishop Jackson, those are the things that we're dealing with, and those are the things that we absolutely have to address.
Well, look, I mean, you said a great deal. Wow. Folks, press *6 to get in queue to ask. Press *6 to get in queue to ask Congressman Wittmann a question. And you ought to have a lot of questions on your mind. Let me open this up with the first general question. I am convinced of this. There have been a lot of exotic explanations about President Obama. He's a Manchurian candidate. He wasn't born in the U.S. He's a Muslim. And I've always said that part of that is his thinking seems to be so bizarre that people are constantly groping for an explanation to understand what is motivating him. How does he come up with this stuff when he goes to Paris and says that global warming is, doing a conference on climate change is going to be a rebuke to ISIS? I mean, it's preposterous. How are you all in Congress processing the way he thinks and what likely is going to happen over the next 14 months that he's got left in office? Because I just think that he could do immense damage to this country with use of executive orders and so forth. Frankly, I get a little bit disturbed when I hear Congressman Ryan, I hear Speaker Ryan sort of talk like, well, we're going to work with him. And I'm thinking, but to work with him on what? I mean, the man is completely out to lunch. So that's just me. Probably some of the people on this call. But Congressman, how do you all process the things he says and does and what Congress is going to do to respond? I mean, just like, for example, if you don't agree with bringing Syrian refugees in here, you are some kind of bigot or hater, or you're trying to put religious, just basically absolutely no acknowledgement that there's any risk to the American people in doing this. So that's a long question, and then we'll go to others, but respond to that. What's your thinking on it?
Well, I'm like you. I have a hard time, an almost impossible time, bringing myself to a point where I can understand his viewpoints. To me, they're counterintuitive to the things we see around us. To me, it's pretty simple. We see the threats. We see the things that we must do as a nation to counter those threats. And we have to be willing to lead. I think the president has a mindset to say, no, we believe that people look at the United States as the imperialist United States and placing our desires and will on everybody else, and everybody else has to do what we say, and somehow pulling that back and saying we're gonna go to the back of the line. We're not going to lead. We're just kind of let the world go on its own. And we see what happens with that. We see that U.S. leadership is needed. The U.S. has always led. We have led the fight against evil, going all the way back to Nazism in World War II. If the United States doesn't do it, then who else does? And I just don't think that's a place where the president is in his mindset. I don't know what his reasoning is behind that, how he gets to that, but I'm a firm believer that that's where he is, that he looks at it and says, no, the United States should not be doing these things. He does not want to have a military that has the capability or the presence to deter those efforts around the world. And remember, a strong military is not to prosecute the fight. It's to prevent the war. It's to provide the deterrent. And I just don't think that he has that particular mindset. And short of that, what we have to do as members of Congress, whether it's on the House Armed Services Committee, the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Intelligence Committee, is to say these are the things that we need to do to protect American interests, not just here on the homeland, but also around the world, and understand that a strong military presence creates that deterrent to where we don't have to worry about those efforts showing up on our shores, which they have already, and to understand, too, that we have an obligation, as you said, first and foremost, to protect Americans. It's our constitutional duty. That should be at the top of the list, and we should never walk away from that. And granted, there are elements of what we're going to have to address as far as immigration policy as it relates to Syrians. And we are still a humanitarian nation that wants to bring in people that are refugees from political persecution. But we have an obligation to protect this nation. We have an obligation to make sure that they are not coming here to do harm to our citizens. That's our constitutional responsibility. We cannot walk away from that, and we cannot think that by not addressing it, it's somehow going to go away. We have to do this. That's our obligation, Bishop. So I'm like you. I'm frustrated with what I hear coming out of the president in words, but I'm also concerned about actions. But what that does, I believe, is it places upon Congress the responsibility to act if the president will not, and to counter whatever he tries to do or what he doesn't do, whether it's through executive orders or through lack of action, to assure that we are doing our constitutional duty to provide for the defense both abroad and here in the homeland.
Okay, folks, Bill, let's go right to the questions. If you could keep your questions right to the point and give the Congressman a chance to respond, we should be able to get all of you in. Go right ahead, Bill.
Go ahead, Gary.
Hi, Gary Porter, Yorktown. Thanks for your service, Congressman.
Hey, Gary.
And also thanks for your leadership in the Congressional Prayer Caucus project that's underway. I hope we'll have a chance to mention that at the end here.
Yes.
My question is, considering the Constitution, which you just brought up, a plain reading of Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the exclusive authority to set rules for the government of the military.
Yes.
And yet we see the executive instead setting rules and pushing gender-confused individuals into the military and now pushing women into all combat roles. When is Congress going to dust off their pocket constitutions and insist that they are the ones that have exclusive right to set rules for the military?
Well, Gary, you're right. Article 1, Section 8 is very clear that we are to provide for the nation's defense and supply its armies and navies. Obviously, today, the Air Force being an extension of that, as well as our Marine Corps as an extension of the Navy, and really our Coast Guard that provides for another level of protection there. We have to do that, and we do that each and every year through the National Defense Authorization Act. We set the policy for where our military goes, and that includes issues about women in combat, and we're having a hearing on that today to try to determine what the course of action is going to be with our military to make sure that we have the proper direction in that policy. I want to make sure that we have the same standards. I want to make sure that our units are going to function the same way. I don't have any issues with women serving or even serving in combat roles, but we need to make sure that we don't change the standard, because that's a very, very high-functioning and high-performing job, and I want to make sure that everybody in those units is able to perform. And I think that's incumbent upon us here in Congress. So you're right, Gary. We do have to dust off our pocket constitutions and make sure that we do our job and that we adopt policies. And remember, we have the power of the purse, too. So it's not only getting the policy right, but it's also assuring that we put our fingerprint on this nation's defense efforts, and both establishing readiness and how we provide for our military in what we do, not just in the policy and the authorization, but also in the appropriation, which will be coming up here in the next week.
Okay, next question.
Go ahead, Mike.
Hello, Congressman. Thank you for all you do. My name is Mike Valerio, and I want to ask a question. What power does the Congress really have to steer Obama in the direction of fighting our enemies like the jihad around the world and ISIS? Isn't doing nothing or not enough to stop ISIS and other enemies disarming America a form of betrayal? Congress shouldn't continue to be politically correct, I don't think. Congress should tell the president that what he is doing is a form of betrayal, and call it what it is, treason against his oath of office. It seems to me until Republicans stand up, nothing will change. A patriot once wrote a book during the Vietnam War. I think his name was Stormer, and it was called None Dare Call It Treason. And nobody ever did call it treason. As a result, we lost the Vietnam War, and we've lost every war since then. And no one is calling it treason now. And I'm just wondering when Congress or someone in Congress has the courage to do that, because until that happens, the president will keep doing what he's doing.
Well, Mike, we have to do several things. First of all, Congress can direct what happens with our nation's military efforts. What we can do is this. We must demand from the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the President a strategy to defeat ISIS. And right now, at best, it's a piecemeal. So we don't even know what the full intention is because we haven't seen all the pieces. Secondly, is I think Congress needs to debate and provide its constitutional duty through an authorization of the use of military force. As you point out, there hasn't been a formal declaration of war since World War II. Every other of the conflicts we've been in since then have not been done through a formal declaration of war. And I think there needs to be a debate about what is this threat, what does the United States need to do to defeat it, and what's our purpose in doing that. And that is indeed part of our constitutional requirements And from there, you can point out what the executive branch is or is not doing. But they have to be able to put those things forward because, you know, even if you talk about holding the executive branch accountable, which is what we need to do, we have to hold them accountable to under the conditions of understanding exactly what it is that they propose to do. And by not putting that information out there, we don't know. And you can make supposition about what's lacking and saying, well, that is indeed a decision not to make a decision. But if we have a conclusive strategy provided to us and say this is what we're going to do, then we can indeed make judgments about what Congress needs to do and where the executive branch actions are lacking, and have the debate about the authorization to use military force and have Congress act upon that. So there's a clear direction to the commander-in-chief. We provide that direction. Short of that debate on the authorization to use military force, I think we still end up floundering.
Okay, next question.
Okay, go ahead, Doris.
Yes, thank you for joining the call today. I think we have a bigger problem in addition to the security because of our immigration, but also due to the fact that our labor participation rate is so low. We have so many people that try to find a way to make a living and make a life worth living, and then our congressmen and senators and president are not providing advocacy to we the people, so they're committing fraudulent misrepresentation, and then they're denying us our due process rights of being able to have good faith negotiations and good faith.
Bill, listen, Bill, his time is getting short, so you got to get to the question. Give him a chance to answer it.
Yeah, well, we should have good faith negotiations and good faith bargaining, mutuality of agreement in governance in order for us to be equals and not be burdened, encumbered, and obligated to laws against our own will without our consent.
Yeah, well, Bill, I agree. I do think that we need to make sure that we are looking at all sectors of society, including the middle class. You talk about labor participation rate. There needs to be good faith efforts at every level, both parties and executive branch, legislative branch.
We got two more questions. If you ask your question quickly and the congressman answers them quickly, we can get you in before the bottom of the hour.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Erin.
Yes. Yeah, this is Erin Anderson, and I live in Northern Virginia near the Pentagon.
Yes.
My family, we've all been, we're a military community. We're all a military community, okay? And I appreciate all of your comments regarding, because you're on the Armed Services Committee, how our military has been gutted.
Yes.
Okay. And but for us Jane and Joe citizens, we're seeing the immediate reaction, of course, what we're seeing on TV, Syrian refugees being shipped here to the United States. Okay. What can you tell us as Jane and Joe citizens? How best can we push back on this? What do we need to do? Because to be, not to be impolite, but we really don't have much faith in Capitol Hill. I mean, we have provided the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the Senate with a Republican majority, and we don't really have confidence in Ryan. And that's the reason why Jane Joe citizens, are supportive of a guy like Trump. The only one who seems to be speaking to us Jane Joe citizens. So what can you tell us to do so that we can push back on what we see as an immediate threat to us here in the homeland?
Sure. Well, Erin, a couple things pretty simply, and we're going to be taking that up this week. This visa waiver program where individuals can actually get a visa waiver from another country to come to the United States from the Middle East, from Syria, we have to stop that. I do believe we have good common sense legislation on the policy concerning Syrian refugees. That will be part of these budget negotiations as far as an appropriations bill. So we have an obligation as Congress to put in place the right policy to protect the American people. And Aaron, you hit it on the head, making sure we're standing by our military, making sure they're strong, but also making sure we put in place policies to force proper due diligence on anybody coming in this country to protect Americans. That's got to be our job one. We have to do everything we can to make that happen.
I got time for one more, Congressman.
Sure. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Let's go to the last question.
All right. Go ahead and ask your question. Identify yourself and ask your question.
Hi, this is William from Chesapeake, Virginia. And Congressman, I want to know how many Muslims have been allowed to enter this country during this presidency? What's their birth rate? Why are we still allowing the Syrians to continue to come into this country? And how many Muslims are in different levels of government, senior levels of government, from Department of Homeland Security to the White House itself? And why hasn't this man already been impeached? That's what I want to know.
Sure. Well,
I want to
William,
know that.
Sure. Well, William, I don't have a number in front of me as to the number of Muslims that are in the government or in these different areas. But remember, we have to be careful about categorizing individuals across the spectrum as far as their religion, because we've seen that happen in the past, and we don't want to be in the business of religious persecution. What I want to make sure—
This isn't just religion, though. This is an all-encompassing.
Okay.
This is an all-encompassing thing that covers everything. Sharia law,
it is.
The military, everything.
It is.
Well, we got it.
William, I agree. Listen, we need to be looking at the actions and making sure we're addressing the actions. And I think that's the key here, whether it's Syrians, whether it's folks coming in that want to perpetrate harm, that have been radicalized, that look at the practice of their religion in believing that they need to harm others to do that. William, that's the issue that we need to be looking at, and that's the issue where we need to develop the proper policy, whether it's dealing with Syrian immigrants here escaping persecution there in their home countries, regardless across the board. We have to look at actions, and we have to make sure that we are gathering the right information to determine whether or not people are allowed entrance into this country. That, again, goes back to our obligation to protect the country and to protect American citizens. And I think that's where people's angst is today. I know that's where my angst is, in looking at the system and saying, are we doing that? Are we doing that in a comprehensive way? Do we understand what is behind these actions, like the couple we saw in San Bernardino, and what do we do to make sure that we can identify those individuals before they perpetrate those acts of terror? How do we identify those individuals and say, listen, we believe there's a question here. Maybe you shouldn't be allowed entrance into the country. As you know, of the couple there, the lady who came from Pakistan gave a false address. Of course, we find that out afterwards, whereas if we knew it beforehand, we could have potentially kept her from entering the country. It's those types of actions, William, that we must look at to make sure that we are indeed protecting Americans. I think that's where the crux of the tough policy decisions need to be made, and it's Congress's responsibility to do that. It's our responsibility to set the policy to make sure that we are protecting the country and making sure that those individuals, as we saw a couple of weeks ago in San Bernardino, do not make their way into the country, and make sure that we're protecting Americans. We have much more to do along those lines, and I appreciate your observations, and I share your frustration, too, in where we are today. We are not anywhere close to where we need to be to make sure we have the proper policy on immigration to protect Americans.
Hey, Congressman, as you go, please remember this, that the military is not a place for sexual and social experimentation. It's supposed to be a fighting force, and this president, I think, is destroying it from within with all this LGBT stuff. That's got to stop. It really does. But look, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for the time. You went over your time. We really appreciate that. And let's come back again, and let's talk again maybe in a few months.
We will do that, Bishop Jackson. I'm glad to come back anytime. Just let me know, and we will be back and give you an update on what's going on here in Washington.
All right. Thank you, sir. God bless
Thanks
you.
again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Have a blessed day.
Folks, all right. You too. You too, Congressman Wittmann.
Thanks.
Folks, the Congressman and I were talking before we opened up the lines, and I just want you all to know, I didn't have time to get into this with him because I wanted to get to your questions. I could have a long discussion with these folks if I had the time to be with them, but I want you to get an opportunity to talk to them. I talked to him about this, that there is a distinction between Islam purely as religion, which is bad in itself. Let's just get that on the record. I mean, it's bad in itself. That's because it's just wrong. It's just off. And Islam as a political system, which is downright dangerous. See, because Islam is both. Muhammad, as the premier example of what it means to be Islamic, was much more a political leader and a military leader than he was a religious figure. Because most of the advances of Islam came through military action, not through persuasion, not through preaching, not through prophecies about some God he concocted in the wicked imagination of his own heart, but they came through conquest, fighting, killing, enslaving. And this idea that is not an authentic part of Islam is downright delusional. It is an authentic part of Islam. If, in fact, to be the perfect Muslim is to be exactly like Muhammad, then you subdue your enemies. You bring them under subjugation. You bring them to heel. And we got to realize that's what we're dealing with. And so parsing the two out is difficult because, look, I love our Constitution and I believe in our First Amendment rights. If a person wants to go out and worship Allah or a cow or the moon or the sun or whatever they want to do, I certainly try to persuade them otherwise as a preacher of the gospel of Jesus Christ, try to persuade them that those things make a very poor God. But I don't want the government trying to tell them they can't. But when you have a system that says, wait a minute, this system demands that the government bow to us and that the government bow to Sharia law and that the government become an instrument for justifying me beating my wife or killing my child or anything, whatever it is, that we got a problem. And that's the problem that we've got. You know, we're calling these people radicalized. Are they radicalized? Is that the most accurate way to describe them? Or are they Mohammedized? See, I think they're Mohammedized. I think they are doing exactly what the prophet of their false religion wants them to do. And I think the modern peaceful Muslim who doesn't want any part of that has decided simply that they're not going to embrace that part of the religion and they're not going to emulate Muhammad in that way. But nobody who is honest can deny that it's there. It is there. And you think about this whole refugee situation, he's talking about bringing in 10,000 refugees, and let's just assume for a moment that only 1% of them, only 1%, I think it's larger than that, but let's assume for the sake of discussion, 1% is Muslim fanatics, terrorists, jihadists. Only 1%. That's still 100. You know how many people they think were involved in the Paris attack? I mean, they think that it only took about 5 people. I mean, we know that the killings themselves only took 2. And so you're talking about bringing potentially 100 people into the country to plot and scheme to make your mall, your bank, your local establishments, places where you could be ambushed and gunned down by some fanatic who's decided he wants to hit a soft target, and that place where you happen to go is a soft target that day. I mean, and then they want to keep bringing them in. This is only the beginning. So if 100 becomes 1,000, I mean, imagine 1,000 of these jihadists wandering around our country, plotting, scheming. In fact, we may have 1,000 in the country or many, many more than that now. We may have sleepers in the country now. We just don't know where they are, who they are. So this idea that somehow Islam should be left alone because, after all, we're, as the president likes to lecture us about our values, and of course he doesn't know anything about American values, but nevertheless he likes to lecture us about that. It is not an American value to allow people who want to overthrow your way of life to come into this country. That is not an American value. And insofar as we know that some of those Syrian refugees, and God bless the ones who are innocent and victimized, and God bless them, but it is insane. To me, this is the calculation. How many lives how many lives, how many lost American lives, how many bullets through the heads of women, children, bombs exploded, how many of those justifies bringing in the Syrian refugees in order to demonstrate to the world our compassion? And you know what the number is for me? 0. 0. This should be the loss of not a single American life to help the Syrian refugees. We can help them where they are. We can set up safe havens there. We can try to protect them there. We got 65 nations, right? 65, what a crock. 65 nations in our coalition. Let's send some troops from the 65 nations over there to build a wall around them, a fence around them, to guard them, to help them, to bring food in there. I'll contribute. But don't bring them here, because not one American life should be lost, because we are willing to take a risk in order to help Syrian refugees. And look, may I be perfectly honest about this too? Frankly, except in very, very rare instances, have I heard any expression of gratitude from any Muslims who have been helped by the United States of America. I mean, we lost 4,000 lives trying to free the Iraqis. And I don't even know what the number is for Afghanistan. And I haven't heard any gratitude. I haven't heard anybody coming saying, look, we just want to let Americans know that we are grateful. They spilled their blood and their treasure to help us, and we will never forget them. No, all I hear is a grudging disdain. I mean, basically just a grudging acknowledgement, if that. And the president's always talking about occupying. He says, we don't want to go over there and occupy. You know, that's the way he thinks. If Americans go over there to fight for our freedom and to defend people who want to kill us, somehow we're the occupiers. I mean, folks, it is totally exasperating to have to listen to the stuff that this man spews. And by the way, that is exactly why Donald Trump said what he said. And I don't even know what he said. This part about not letting Muslims come in, it's got everybody up in arms. And the part that did bother me is you can't keep American citizens out. Now, if they go and they engage in fighting for, it's ISIS or Al Qaeda or against for any of our enemies, as far as I'm concerned, their citizenship should be revoked. I don't care if they were born here. But I'm not talking about that. You can't, have people visiting loved ones maybe in a Middle Eastern country and then they can't come back because they're Muslims. You just can't do that. Now, I don't know that he said that. That's why I hate to even get into it, because I don't know what he said. All I know is what people said about what he said. But here's the point. He struck a chord because the American people are tired of the crap. They're tired of being told that trying to look out for our own interests somehow makes you a bigot and a hater and a racist, this, that, and the other. I mean, they're just tired of it. And along comes Donald Trump, sometimes bombastically, but says what a lot of other people are probably thinking, and all of a sudden the liberals and even some conservatives just go crazy. Well, look, we need to have a serious, honest, thoughtful discussion about allowing Muslims into this country. How can you not? How can you not? I mean, it would be insane to suggest anything otherwise. And here again, it's because Islam is not just a religion. I mean, suppose Nazism had been a religion, but they also took over Germany. Would we say, well, now we don't want to talk about the Nazis because, we don't want to violate their religion. Their religious liberty. No, because we would know that they are also a political and military system bent on dominating the world. So we would have ignored the religious part and dealt with them on the other part. So we got to do the same thing for Islam. We got to ignore the religious part where we have to and just deal with the political and military implications of what Islam means. That's the only reasonable, rational way for the country to do this. And yes, that means you got to look at whether people should be allowed in here. Of course it does. I mean, what are we nuts? Let people kill our loved ones because we want to be politically correct and we want to honor people's religious liberty. Look, if somebody's religion is cutting off my head, guess what? I have no respect for their religion. I have no respect for them. And the sooner they're dead, the better off we are. And we just don't know which is which right now. We don't know who the people are who, as this couple did, who hide their real intentions and melt into the woodwork and then come out when it's time for them to go on their killing spree. We don't know who these people are. So, of course, it's appropriate to raise the question, who should we be allowing in here? Of course it is. How we do that needs to be rational, needs to be reasonable. I think I've shared with you, I have Muslims in my family. I believe I'm trying to get them saved. Now, one of them, as a matter of fact, is not in the country right now. I wouldn't want him to be banned from coming back to his children, to his family. To my knowledge, he's not engaged in any nefarious activity. He's a translator. So we got to think through this thing. But to raise the question, I mean, I think only a fool wouldn't raise the question. So folks, look, we're going to keep fighting the good fight. Now, let me just tell you before we go, tomorrow we're having our national press conference for Project Awakening at the National Press Club tomorrow at 9:45 a.m. You all be praying for us. If you're in the Northern Virginia area, the Washington, D.C. area, come on over to the National Press Club. We'd love to have you there for the announcement. And then at 12 o'clock, we're having our 4th Christian Awakening Summit at Victory Temple Baptist Church in Alexandria, Virginia. And so we continue to march on, folks. I know the emergency continues, but you know what? The emergency response continues as well. And we're not about to back off or back down. And I was so glad for the question, a couple of questions that were asked, because Congress has got to get in gear. Congress has got to get in gear, and they've got to make it their mission over the next 14 months to stop this man from doing any more damage to the country. That's got to be, to me, that ought to be their mission statement. Next 14 months, what does Congress do? Stop Barack Obama from doing any more damage to the United States of America. There's your mission statement right there. And then get on it. So, folks, thank you all for staying in the fight. That's the only way we're going to get Congress or anybody else to do anything, when they know that we, the people, are worked up and concerned, and we're simply not going to be treated like we're somehow bystanders in the process. No, we're the sovereigns of this country. The authority that Congressman Wittmann and others have was delegated to them by us, we the people, through the vehicle of the Constitution and our right to vote. So we're not going to be treated like bystanders. We're going to be treated like who we are. We're the bosses. We're the people to whom they answer. And when we're not getting the answers we want, we got to fire them and bring somebody else in. That's the way it's got to go. So, folks, thank you all for staying with it, keeping at it. I know it looks dark sometimes, but listen, you know that old saying, it's always darkest before the dawn? Well, there's a scripture that's concomitant to that. It says, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. I believe there's going to be a time of joy in our country. It's coming. I believe we're going to see an awakening in the land. It's coming, and we just have to keep fighting every step of the way until we see that breakthrough that we know God will give us, that we're looking for, that we're hungry for, that we're praying for. God's not going to let this country go down, folks. He's not going to let it go down. And remember this, we cannot be defeated if we will not quit, because we are on God's side. God bless you. We'll be back with you next Tuesday.